Hi everyone, I'm Shelley and you're watching There's No Place Like Home. It's time for another installment of the Question the Narrative series. And today I'm going to explore with you some really interesting underground cities. And I have to tell you that the main inspiration for this video, I'm actually going to save for last because you know how the saying goes, save the best for last. But in actuality, all of the places that I'm going to be sharing with you today are just as interesting. It's just that that one really blew my mind when I found out about it. Now, a lot of the places that I'm going to be sharing with you today are actually places that people left in the comments for me, like in the past week or two. And it's funny because I have been contemplating doing a video about underground cities for a few weeks now, and it just seems that people started dropping links to places that were underground, and it just went perfectly with this theme. So I absolutely have to include these. So let's start with Seneca Village. Decades before Central Park was even a concept, Seneca Village began to grow into a tight-knit settlement of African American and Irish landowners. Centered near the current west side of Central Park at 85th Street, Seneca Village was an example of a self-sufficient middle-class minority community, and I want to point out it was African American and Irish landowners, and yes, the Irish were considered minorities at the time. Minority community that happened to stand in the way of city planners and the wealthiest New York families. When the village was destroyed in 1857, and that's a very interesting year because, as I've mentioned in many videos, a lot of really strange things seem to happen around the mid-1800s, late 1800s. So here we've got 1857. I actually read a theory about a mud flood possibly happening around 1850, so that would be interesting. But anyway, when the village was destroyed in 1857, prior to the construction of Central Park, its story seemed to disappear as well. And there is something else that is very interesting. It wasn't until the 1990s that evidence of Seneca Village began to reemerge, and historians were able to piece together the rise and fall of a once thriving community. So I've been saying in a lot of my videos that we don't really know our true history. We don't really know what happened. The things that we are told are his story, and that is what they tell us is history. But what if it's actually just someone's story, what they want us to know? And I think that we see that happening right now. We see history being rewritten. And do you honestly think that it's the first time? But a lot of times I will have people saying, well, how could they hide something like that? There would be some sort of an account. No, we would know about this. People would have been talking about it, writing about it. But right here we have an example of a village that was destroyed in 1857, and it kind of disappeared. Its story disappeared. And it wasn't until the 1990s, that evidence of this village began to reemerge. So I just moved a little bit farther down because if I would read all these articles to you in their entirety, we would be here all night. So I'm just going to read to you the really relevant parts. I will leave links to everything in the description box though. The city's mayor and other powerful businessmen made it clear that they would throw their full weight behind the project, and when Seneca Village found itself in their way, the small population of minorities had little recourse to save their homes. Newspapers funded by supporters of the park argued that Seneca Village was little more than a swampland home to squatters, making for an easy decision to raise the community. And I have to say that that's something else that you will hear an awful lot. They claim that all of these grand places, now obviously they're not calling this grand because they're saying that it's for squatters, but you'll hear the thing, they said it about Washington, D.C., they said it about Chicago, where the Chicago World's Fair was built. They always claim to be building these things on swampland. And I don't know if that has some meaning or if it's just a coincidence. But anyway, moving on. So anyway, we'll start here again. Making for an easy decision to raise the community. Now here, very relevant here. The phrase, history is written by the victors, rings true when looking at records of Seneca Village. For decades, the only knowledge of the settlement came from descriptions of squalid living conditions. Yet historians have begun to find more to the story. And that is what I have been trying to say over and over again, is that we don't know how much of the story for not just Seneca Village, but for the world. We don't know how much of the story we're missing because we are being told what happened by the victors. I just moved down a little bit farther. So anyway, landowners were paid an average of $700 per lot through eminent domain and were told to vacate by 1857. Some villagers filed lawsuits against the city but were defeated before the project was due to begin. What a surprise. There is also no recorded trace of Seneca Village's population following the construction of Central Park, and no family members of the villagers have been identified. Nonetheless, ongoing research and archaeological digs continue to take place, hopefully uncovering more information about Seneca Village's past. So, in essence, Seneca Village is underneath Central Park, and Seneca Village's history was all but erased. So, let's move on. Next, we will go to, and this is another one that is not, okay, it's not quite underground, it's underwater. And this is something else that someone left me in the comments. And I've heard of Lake Norman before because I love watching this show on Tubi called Boogeymen. And one of the episodes, it's about a lake monster in Lake Norman. So I had already heard of it, but I didn't, and I knew that it was a man-made lake, but I didn't know the story behind it. And so the story is actually very interesting because, yes, there is basically a little part of an underground town underneath the man-made lake of Lake Norman. Oh, by the way, Lake Norman is in North Carolina, but let's just start reading here. A little over 60 years ago, the bed of Lake Norman was dry. So Lake Norman is actually a relatively new lake. So it says here, it was first created in 1959 and 1964. So I'm not coming on here to say that all of these places, all have some connection to like the mud flood or anything. But what I am showing you is how common these underground, or in this case, underwater cities actually are. And I think that a lot of times people are incredulous that I would happen to mention that maybe a town was built on top of another town. But I'm going to show you that there are lots of examples of these underground or underwater places. So anyway, let's move down here. The plan for the dam was conceived in the 1890s. There's that magic year again. In the 1890s by an engineer working on the Niagara Falls Dam who proposed damming the Catawba, that's the Catawba River, for hydroelectricity to James Buchanan Duke in 1905. Now here they tell us that underneath the lake, there are the remains of a summer camp that opened in 1938 and the site of the Battle of, I'm not sure how to say that, Cowan's Ford, where General William Lee Davidson fought Lord Cornwallis in 1781. There are the original sites of graveyards moved to higher ground, like the Cornelius Family Cemetery and the Hunter's Chapel, M.E. Zion Church Cemetery. There are old plantations, old home sites, old highways. There is even an airplane discovered by firefighters using sonar in 2013. And I believe I saw it earlier that the person who actually planned this out, I already said that. The idea was conceived in the 1890s. Yeah, I mentioned that in the video that I made yesterday. My brain is still like a little muddled from this sickness, so you'll have to excuse me. But anyway, let's move on. So yeah, so now we've got but we've got a bunch of structures, a camp, a graveyard, plantations, highways, airplanes underneath Lake Norman. All right, so let's move on to Seattle. Now, someone else told me also about Seattle, and I don't know if I mentioned it, but someone else had told me about Seneca Village as well. But now, Seattle Underground, yeah, there's an old city underneath it, an actual city under the ground. So, we started out with a settlement being under Central Park, and then we talked about a settlement being under a man-made lake. But now we're going to talk about a city under a city. And that is really the main point of this video. And actually, Seattle wasn't even my main inspiration for this, but it fits right with it. I'll be getting to that one next, but let's just take a look at this because this is very strange indeed. Seattle Underground, the remains of the old city that were abandoned and left in ruins until the 1950s. So there's some photos of it. Seattle Underground hides the remnants of the old city. Under the streets of Pioneer Square neighborhood, there is an entire network of subterranean hallways, corridors, and basements where the city of Seattle was born. And there, the ruins of shops, hotels, houses can be seen still standing. Over the recent decades, these spaces have become a popular attraction and a history museum of Seattle's earliest days. And now I'm noticing this here, so I have to say something that I often point out in my videos, especially the ones where I go around my town, about how you can often find mud flood houses by looking for the brick ones. And as you can see, we've got a lot of brickwork here. Does that, and yeah, to me, this screams of mud flood to me. But anyway, who knows? Let me see. Let's go down. See, there's some more brickwork there. In the mid-19th century, these structures were on the ground level, and all the buildings were made of wood. Now, that's the story that they tell us all the time, and they very well could have been. However, most of them were destroyed in the Great Seattle Fire. Well, I don't know if you've seen my video on the Great Fires, but basically every single major city, not even just in the United States, but all around the world, experienced what they call a Great Fire that basically destroyed the entire city. And most of them happened in the 19th century or very early 20th century. And one of the reasons that is given is because all the buildings were made of wood, which again could be true, but it's odd that every city experienced a citywide fire. And a lot of times these fires seem to correspond with these really odd stories, like this underground city. Anyway, and it happened on June 6, 1889. Awfully close to that 1890 I talk about all the time, isn't it? That day, sometime after 2:30 in the afternoon, a cabinet maker and employee in Victor Claremont's woodworking shop by the name of Jonathan Edward Black accidentally forgot the glue that he was heating over a gasoline fire. And that is something else that we will often hear with these fires, is something, very what seems very small, starting a citywide fire. And I know they say that winds had something to do with it and everything, which is fine. But in Chicago, for the longest time, they said that the Chicago fire was started by a cow tipping over a lantern or something like that, which I know they say now, oh, well, that's just an old wives' tale. But there were people who actually said that was why it actually happened. And so, yes, you'll find a lot of these odd stories with the fires. Now, this actually tells you how the fire continued on. And as I was reading this, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Final Destination, but that's what I thought of with Final Destination, where it's basically like where one thing goes wrong and it's just like a domino effect until it's like a disaster. And that's what happens here. So let's back up here. So he accidentally forgot the glue that he was heating over a gasoline fire. The glue boiled over and caught fire, very easily spreading to the floor covered in turpentine and wooden chips. In the ensuing chaos, John tried to extinguish the fire with water, which made it even worse because the water thinned the turpentine and spread the fire even more. So if you've seen Final Destination, you know exactly why I said that when it comes to that. Anyway, so everyone inside got to get out of the building in the nick of time. But by the time the fire department came to the scene, the fire was out of control. The abundance of smoke made it impossible for the firemen to trace the source of the fire. On top of that, precisely that day, the fire chief happened to be out of town. Oh, another coincidence. These stories are always filled with coincidences. And the volunteers who came to the scene made a mistake of using too many hoses at once. This led, they spelled lead wrong, that drives me crazy. This led the water pressure to drop completely. So again, all of these coincidences, and we hear them all the time in these stories. More brickwork. There's the arches. I always talk about the arched window. This looks like an arched doorway. We see these on mud flood buildings, and here we have an entire town underground. Okay. The fire caused the Dietz and Meyer liquor store to explode. Then it spread to the Crystal Palace Saloon and the Opera House Saloon. And because of the huge amounts of alcohol, very soon the entire block from Madison to Marion was on fire. The fire kept on burning till 3 a.m., destroying anything in its path. And when it was finally extinguished, the damage done was massive. Over 25 blocks were destroyed, and more than 5,000 people lost their jobs and livelihood. However, apparently no one had died because there are no known statistics on that. Another anomaly. Anyway, let's just continue because there's some other really weird things. So that now, after this happened, the city's leaders gathered to discuss what the next step would be, and they came to the crucial decision that paved the way for Seattle's future. All new buildings must be built of stone and brick, even though it looks like these buildings here are built of stone and brick, but I'm guessing that they missed that. Anyway, so all new buildings must be built of stone and brick to prevent this kind of disaster from happening. And second, it was decided for the streets to be raised 22 feet higher than the original grade. So yeah, so they're going to raise these streets 22 feet higher. And that in itself is a very interesting story about how they did that. And I actually have a link because I was like, how in the world did they raise the city by 22 feet? And I'll leave the link because yeah, it's very, to me, very convoluted. Like the original commenter pointed out, they originally had ladders that people would have to climb if they wanted to go shopping, and they would have to go down a ladder, to go in the lower town before the upper town was finished, and then they would climb back up the ladder to go to the upper town. And like the commenter said, imagine these women, 19th century, wearing these long skirts, they're shopping and they're having to climb ladders. The whole thing just sounds very nonsensical. Now, though, we're going to get to the original purpose. So let's go to, not this one, this one. Okay, so as you can see, this was my video that I shared in my last video, and I'm not going to make you sit through this whole video again. But what I wanted to show you is that I am very quickly, I'll show you. I am showing you, so the entrance to the cave is down there. This is how high up this goes, several stories up. And yeah, so the entrance of the cave, you can see my kids walking. It's actually down there in the ground. And in my very first video, in which I featured Bedbug Cave, I mentioned how there were stories that some of the houses in town have basements, that the doors open up into the tunnel. And I remember thinking to myself, that doesn't seem to make any sense because, first of all, if you look up here, I'll go up. It doesn't even do it justice how high up it is, but the tunnels mostly go that way, go forward. They do go back also, but all the way up there. And I'm thinking, how were there basements opening up into this tunnel? And I thought, unless it's possible that there were houses built on top of houses. If there was some sort of mud flood or some sort of catastrophe, I was thinking, maybe when the new people came, they built on top of what was originally there. And someone had mentioned to me, well, that can't happen. You can't build houses on top of other houses. The foundation wouldn't be strong enough. It would collapse. And so then and that had me thinking, and I was thinking, well, but I know that there's evidence of cities being built on cities worldwide. And I just showed you right there in Seattle, the town built on the town. And then I came across the story of underground Naples, Italy. And that is a very interesting story indeed. So now Naples is, it's a present day city, but what a lot of people don't know is that there is an entire underground city 20 feet below the entire city of Naples. So over 60% of the new, I'm calling it the new Naples. I should call it the current Naples, the present day Naples. Over 60% of present day Naples is built over top of this old city. And look at there's the beautiful brickwork again, beautiful masonry. Now, this was said to be from the time of Nero. So this is extremely old. And again, I have to say it. The original or the newer city is built directly on top of this one. And I'm going to leave a link to a really good video. Now it's by the History Channel, and I have to admit that a lot of times I'm a little bit leery about the History Channel because I know that a lot of times they just kind of follow the normal narrative. And so I don't agree with everything in the video, but I will say that it gave me some really interesting insight. So let me just go to this really quickly. And so what it's saying here is that it wasn't volcanic ash or lava. And by the way, I have to say that Naples is right by Mount Vesuvius, and there had been an eruption of Mount Vesuvius. And it was the one that destroyed Pompeii. Anyway, so it says it wasn't volcanic ash or lava that wiped out this street scene. So this one here, it was a mudslide. So sadly, I'm recording this segment for you because I was trying to show you a few seconds of the video that I was talking about because they showed a really good animation of a mudslide that was caused by the volcano. But unfortunately, they wanted to take all the revenue of the video for their 45 seconds. So I'm editing that out. But anyway, what it basically was explaining was that the mud in this mudslide that actually destroyed this underground city of Naples was as heavy as wet cement. So yeah, again, when I talk about mud floods, this isn't something that is unprecedented. And 700 years after this happened, they built a church on top of 10 feet of hardened mud. So again, when we talk about people building on top of other houses or buildings or towns that were mud flooded, this is not something that is really all that difficult to understand. You hear that? They built directly on 10 feet of hardened mud. So 700 years passed. So I'm not saying that, and I'm saying that we don't know how often this has happened. Even here in the US, we don't know how often this has happened, that people have built on top of prior civilizations. The whole idea of the mud flood is just that people came upon older civilizations. Perhaps the buildings were not completely covered. They dug out the bottom or whatever was covered and then renovated them and then used them for themselves. And that is what I've been trying to say. And some people just find it so impossible to believe that something like that could happen. But here we have evidence. 700 years passed, and they came in and they built a church right on the hardened mud. So anyway, and here's something else that's very interesting. So they never would have known, like to this day, no one would have known that this whole underground city was underneath Naples, except in World War II, there was some damage done to the church. And so when they went in, they had to go in and try to fix the foundation. And that was when they discovered this whole underground city. And that also really reminded me of another thing that had to do with Bedbug Cave in my own area. This is the entrance to Bedbug Cave. I showed you earlier when I was showing some of the video where my kids were walking. This is the entrance. It's a hole in the ground. And like the underground city in Naples, it was supposedly discovered after there were some factories that were built in front of the quarry. The Bedbug Bedbug is part of a quarry, and the factories were supposedly built in front of it right after it closed, and they were only open for a couple decades. And then supposedly there was a fire. There's always a fire, as I mentioned earlier. And then all of a sudden they claim to have discovered. They discovered this quarry entrance that I don't know, to me discovered means that they didn't know about it. And think about what the word discovered actually means. Discovered, like it uncovered something. So how could they not know about something that was there 20 years before? Now, at least when it comes to Naples, a long time had passed. But here we have another incident of some sort of major event happening where something is destroyed and then something is discovered. And to me, I just found that to be really interesting in the context of everything else. So it looks to me like, yes, so we're back in underground Naples, obviously. We are no longer by my Bedbug Cave. But anyway, these look to be like some automobiles from the 1940s. So I'm assuming that after the the underground city was discovered after they went down to fix that foundation, that they might have brought these down here. But what ended up happening was that when they excavated after it was discovered, 1.4 million cubic feet of mud was removed. 1.4 million cubic feet of mud. Yes, mud was removed. And if you watch the video, what they will tell you is that these buildings are in stellar condition. In fact, they look very similar to the buildings that are up above level now, the little businesses and stuff. That sounded really intelligent, and stuff. But anyway, my nose is stuffy, maybe that's why. But anyway, they're like in pristine condition. And how are they in pristine condition? Well, they said the reason is the mud. The mud preserved them and kept this structure beautiful, almost like no time has passed at all. And again, you go back to when we're saying that they are discovering these old buildings and everything. If mud has that preservative effect of buildings, why wouldn't they then just go on and use them themselves? So really, I'm hoping that this just gave you some more to think about. Anyway, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed and would like to hear more of what I have to say, I would love if you would do that. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave one either here or on Instagram. And if you like my work and would like to check out my Patreon page, I will leave a link in the description box for that as well. And I hope you have a great day.